Hi everyone, I'm Jo McKim, Deeper Learning Resource Teacher here with Maddie Shepard for an introduction to personalized learning.
Hi everyone, Maddie Shepard here. Jo and I are excited to go over this PD with you. Personalized learning is one of our favorite things to talk about. I'm going to share my screen as soon as Jo makes me the host. And we'll share our slide deck with you with some embedded links and resources so that you can follow along with the info as well. And without further ado, we'll go ahead and get started.
All right, so again, Maddie Shepard, Jo McKim, we are both part of the Deeper Learning team, and those are our Twitter handles. We know that everyone in Jefferson County is really big into Twitter, and we like to know what you're doing during NTI, what you're doing in your schools, and how you're moving students through our different learning experiences in our schools. So feel free to follow us and tag us when you're sharing out the great things happening at your school.
All right, so we always like to start off when we have our PDs. Of course, this one's pre-recorded, so it'll be a little bit different, with a know and need to know protocol. And the reason we do this is a few reasons. One, we like to see what folks know about personalized learning, what they've heard about it, in case there's anything we want to lift up and make sure that we affirm, or any misconceptions that we want to address. We also like to know what folks need to know so that we're able to cater our instruction and personalize our resources and our discussion points around what people need to know. We know that everyone's dealing with different contexts and different levels and different groups of kids every year. And so our need to knows change from group to group. So we always like to check in with our participants and see what our need to knows are.
And this is really a useful thing to do with students within your classrooms as well. Because part of personalized learning is letting students identify what they need to know and helping them learn what they need to know. So in order for us to help them, we have to ask them, here's our topic for the day. What do you know about it already? And what questions do you have? And how can our learning experience help answer your questions? So again, putting the student at the center of owning how the instruction moves forward. That's a key element of personalized learning.
And as facilitators, we've done this PD and talked about personalized learning a few times. So there are some questions we can anticipate, and there are some major components of personalized learning that we know we'll likely need to talk about. However, we always try and remain flexible because there's going to be need to knows that come from the group. We need to be able to pivot our instruction to meet our learners' needs. So just like teaching in a classroom, you've got your standards and your competencies that you'll need to teach during the next unit, but make sure to leave some pieces open and remain flexible to be able to cater your instruction to your learners.
All right, so one of the key elements to keep in mind when thinking about personalized learning is how it is different from, or even perhaps inclusive of, differentiation and individualization. Oftentimes, these terms are confused, or someone might misinterpret that if you are individualizing, you are also then automatically personalizing, and that's not true. Individualization is when the teacher is still in charge, and typically we're designing instruction intentionally and individually for a student based on some assessment that we have given them. So if we think about MAP scores or any other kind of standardized assessment where we get data about kids and then we design very intentional interventions, perhaps put them on Khan Academy or Study Island for specific instruction on a standard or skill that they have missed based on an assessment that we have determined, that's individualizing instruction. And there may be a place for that in a personalized learning classroom, but that is not in and of itself personalized learning. Same with differentiation. Differentiation is when we divide students into small groups, but the teacher is still in charge. The teacher is still directing that learning, and we may decide to put students in groups based on, again, those standardized assessments like MAP scores. MAP is great to give us reports ready where kids are already grouped based on their skills and capacities as determined by the MAP assessment. And we can take those small groups and give them certain kinds of learning experiences, whether it's enrichment and moving ahead or some reteaching and intervention on a skill that they've missed based on that data. We can also differentiate, however, based on students' interests. We may put kids in groups for a group project based on what animals they like or what curious questions or inquiry questions they may have that they want to explore. So we can differentiate based on their academic achievement as we've identified through assessment, or we can differentiate based on their learning styles, their interests, their desire to do a certain kind of project or presentation. So there's lots of ways to differentiate in small groups, but it is still teacher driven. The teacher decides what criteria am I using to determine those different small groups. The teacher is deciding what those small groups are doing and how they're learning and how they're going to demonstrate mastery. It's still very teacher directed. So while, again, that may have a place in a personalized learning classroom, it is not in and of itself a personalized learning environment on its own. To truly personalize learning, we have to put the person at the center. And in this case, the person is our student. So what do we know about our students? How do we know what they like, what they're interested in, how they learn best, whether they want to be online on their own, whether they have the stamina to read for 20 minutes or 5 minutes, and how can they start to think of themselves and their own thinking and be metacognitive about their learning and help us by being a part of that process. That's when we really start to personalize, when all of that information about the person helps guide their learning.
On the next slide, we have some graphics that we really like to share. This is a blank chart, and it just highlights the major component that separates all of these things that Joe went over, which is that when we talk about differentiation or individualization, which there are times where in the classroom or in an NTI scenario when those are the most appropriate, absolutely. But the big piece here is that the teacher is still doing the decision making and the teacher is still doing the driving. Here in personalization, the learner is brought into that process. The learner is able to have a coaching conversation and make decisions looking at their own data. They're able to determine what's next on their learning pathway, and they're brought into that process, and that's the big difference here.
A great example of that would be from one of the 8th grade defenses that I sat in on last spring, where a girl who scored way above where she needed to on her MAP reading, she was way above grade level, but in her defense, she said, even though I scored way higher than my goal or what I thought I would on my MAP score, she said, it shows that I still need to work on reading poetry, and in particular, classic poetry. She said, so I'm going to, on her own, she said, I'm going to read more poetry this summer, and I'm going to get myself used to reading poetry. So that's her making a decision about her learning and her choosing to do that reading on her own. And yes, she may have been a more precocious 8th grader to have been in that place at this time during NTI. However, all of our students can get there with some coaching and with scaffolds to help them become metacognitive and think about their thinking.
Absolutely. And as we look at different kinds of learning scenarios within the classroom, when we look at assessment or when we look at mini lessons or small group lessons and all the things in between, this graphic helps us see some explicit differences amongst all of these different kinds of scenarios. So, something very general, looking at who's providing the instruction and who's making the decisions. When we look at differentiation and individualization, the teacher is doing those things. The only difference between differentiation and individualization here is that the teacher is providing instruction to an individual in a one-on-one, and then here in differentiation to a small group. In a personalized scenario, the learner is really making decisions about how they might access new learning, how they might practice or engage with new learning, or how they might demonstrate that learning. Now, the teacher may have had a role in coaching them to help make them or make that decision, or help the student reflect on that decision so they can make better decisions in the future, but the learner is really in the driver's seat. And it's how they actively participate in that decision-making process. You know, here, differentiation and individualization, we're seeing that the teachers are really in charge of making the designs. The teachers are making all of the architectural decisions when it comes to learning experience, but in personalization, the learners really led into that process. Another big piece is this, on this slide, is this last row here, is that the learner has a role in identifying their learning goals. You know, as teachers, we're able to look at data and we, you know, look at our scope and sequence, and we can look at our success skills and help learners identify objectives and identify goals. But it's really when we let learners into that process and coach them to identify their own learning goals that can be academic. You know, I need to work more on poetry, like the example that Joe talked about, or I need to get better at, you know, my voice coming through, or my tone coming through while I'm, you know, writing something, or I need to get better at 2-digit by 2-digit multiplication. You know, it can be an academic goal, or it can be something that is seen as less academic, but still contributes to the academic ecosystem. Like, you know, I need to work on my learning attitude, or I need to be a better listener in groups. And helping learners identify those goals not only helps them own the goals, but helps them drive their process to reach them as well. And we always see, you know, higher efficacy and higher, you know, kind of ownership in what's going on and motivation to participate in what's going on in the classroom when learners have that ownership. This is a part of the same chart. And again, it's just some more explicit examples of how personalization here in the leftmost column differs from differentiation here in the middle and individualization here on the rightmost column. Another key difference that we'll point out is here in this row that's third from the bottom around time. Carnegie units are seat time. And it's, you know, the way that we've been measuring learning long before any of us were educators. It's the model that a lot of educators are still, you know, kind of beholden to, which is kids progress when they've done their time. We measure our own professional learning like that. You know, we get our certificate and we get our stamp when we've done our time, whether or not we can show competency. And when that really starts to shift is when we see elements of personalized learning coming through, when that shifts from being something that's time-based to something that's competency-based. Learners move when and only when they demonstrate that they are competent in a standard skill, you know, or competency. That's hard to do.
That could also be viewed as students get to move on as quickly as they are ready. So we're not holding students back to wait for everyone else. If they've demonstrated mastery on a concept or a skill or a standard, we allow that student to move on to the next.
Exactly. And, you know, when we think about that as learners in our own contexts, a competency-based system for adult learners, you know, would really change the way that we operate as learners, and our student learners are the same. The last thing that we'll kind of point out on this chart is this last row that talks about assessment. There's a lot of prepositions here, but we really like to make the distinction that when we're talking about differentiation or individualization, really the prime beneficiary of the assessment is the teacher. The teacher learns a lot about where the learner is, what they can do, and where they still might need to grow. Where we start to see that assessment really become super meaningful is in personalization, again here in this leftmost column, when the assessment is not only for the teacher to gain information about where the learner is or where they might need to go in future lessons, but the assessment itself is a learning experience, and the assessment itself might be a longer process. Think about our defenses of learning that we recently instituted in Jefferson County. The defense of learning is itself an assessment where we learn a lot about our own practice as teachers and what we need to do better, We learn a lot about what the learners have learned throughout the process, but the kids also learn a lot about themselves having to go through that process. They learn about what kind of presenter they are. They learn about how they may have organized their slides and organized their talking points. Did it work? Did it not work? They learn a lot about how to answer questions, you know, in the moment from the panel. So the assessment itself is a learning process, and the kids learn while the assessment is happening, which isn't always the case when we look at assessments that we see in differentiated or individualized scenarios. Do you have anything to add in that regard, Joe?
No, I think you covered it perfectly. Again, the main key here is in both individualized on the far right and differentiated in the middle. The teacher is the one using assessment data to determine what students are doing, right? Versus for personalized learning, we're using that assessment as a way for students to learn along the way, but we also could have opportunities for students to decide what that looks like. And you'll see that in some of our curriculum frameworks as we start to see more and more performance tasks and project-based learning and service learning experiences where students have more say in how they demonstrate their learning, just like they're doing more as they get creative with their defenses of learning in 5th, 8th, and 12th grade. The main key difference, as you can see, we may be wearing it out, but I don't think we can say it often enough, is that student voice and choice and that learner at the center is the real linchpin that makes a difference for student engagement and really personalizing a classroom or an NTI experience for students. So why does that really matter? Why does student voice really matter? I think we're going to, well, there's a continuum of student voice, and it really shows us that on the left-hand side, we have where the teacher is in charge and students are just participants. And that's really how we do school all the time. That's probably how you got into this PD session. You were given a menu of sessions you could attend. You may have been given a list of here's 3 or 4 or 5 PDs happening at the same time. Pick one and go to it. And then you get to access and engage as you see fit with this particular professional learning. Ideally, however, we want to move students over towards the right end of this continuum of choice, where they start to, in the middle there, co-design and begin designing on their own what those learning experiences will look like, and then ultimately start to advocate for their own challenges or problems or questions. And that's where we start to see that sustained student inquiry, where they really are starting to ask their own questions and advocate to be able to go find ways to answer them and demonstrate our standards at the same time. That's where we really want kids to get. And then on the far right, we start to see students self-regulating their learning based on their passion and their purpose and really being metacognitive. And this is where we see students who perhaps advocated, and I've seen this frequently in some elementary schools in particular, Maddie can probably jump in as an elementary teacher, where students will advocate for, I want to work with this group of students at the low table with flexible seating, and I promise I'm going to be able to do this. This is going to be better for me. And at the end of the day, though, that 4th grader can say, I made a not so great choice today. Tomorrow I'm going to make a different choice. And the next day they really do make a different choice because working with their friends at that table wasn't the best decision for them. But we as educators have to let students make those choices and help them reflect on those choices to make different decisions later. And that's ideally where we want all of our students to get over to that far right, where they're advocating and taking ownership over their choices.
Well, that's true. And what we really want to get to a place where school isn't done to our learners, it's done with them. And we're only going to get to that place if we involve them, if we allow them to make deep choices. You know, we're not talking about the red pencil or the blue pencil choices. We're talking about, you know, you can come down to the carpet to a mini lesson that I'm going to be doing as your teacher. You can access our new learning via a video, or you can work on this task. Those are real, deep, meaningful decisions that learners are able to make and really make decisions about their learning experience. But like Joe mentioned, we can't stop there. it's super important that kids reflect on these experiences. I don't know where this quote came from, but something that comes to mind is that we don't learn from experiences, we learn from reflecting on those experiences. So the more that we can get kids to reflect on the choices that they made so that they can continue to make better and better choices, the more ownership our kids are going to be able to take over their learning.
All right, one thing you hear a lot of when we talk about personalized learning is giving students agency. And so we always want to ask, what does agency mean to you? And in a non-recorded session, we would have a conversation about what does agency mean to you. But in this setting, I want to talk about the three main components of creating student agency, or agency really for anyone. One component is choice, which we've already talked about, that continuum of choice, and making sure it's meaningful and it matters, and that it's not just a false choice of choose A or B or A or B or C, but an option to add their own ideas to that list of choices and be able to be creative in that choice. But also having elements of voice. As a high school teacher, I frequently had lunch chats with representatives from various classes where I would ask them, what do you think we should do to make sure everyone gets this skill or this standard? Or what did you think about, or what did your peers think about this lesson we did last week, and how could it have been different? What can we do differently next time? So giving that voice, but more importantly, I then have to act on that. As the teacher, I'm going to give students voice and let them advocate for what is going to be best for them, but then I have to listen and do something with it. And then on the instruction side, we still want to make sure our students are getting the content that they need and that we are obliged to give them, that it is our job to give them. They need to get the content, but we're going to let students have some influence on how they learn that. How do they access that information? How do they engage and struggle with the problems and the questions and the learning that needs to happen? And then how do they demonstrate that they've mastered it? They get to be a part of that process. When all three of those things come together, we can say that students have truly have agency over their learning. They have a voice, they can advocate, they have choices that they can create, and they have opportunities to learn what is required of them and show that mastery. It takes all of those pieces for a student to have agency.
Well, that's the piece that this graphic does a good job of illustrating, is that any one of these things on their own is awesome. It helps get us closer to learner agency. But when all of these things work together is when we really start to build classroom environments where kids have power, where kids have ownership and agency over their own learning and over their pathway and over their futures. Choice by itself is great, but if learners make that choice and it's not meaningful and it has no influence over their instructional experience, then we've got some room to grow. If voice on its own is one thing. Kids have voices and they use them all the time. But do we integrate their voices and their thoughts and their passions and their opinions into our learning designs? When we do all of these things together, that's when we start to really see personalized learning environments where kids are empowered.
So another way to look at this is with the student agency continuum. On the far left side, we have compliant students. They come to school when we tell them to come to school. They leave when they're told to leave. In between times, they go to the bathroom when they're told. They eat when they're told. In our classrooms, they sit in their assigned seats and raise their hand to be called on to speak. They're very compliant. I don't know about you, but in my classroom, that wasn't always the case, but I welcomed that. I wanted kids to show their individuality and their personality. And so living in that land of compliance didn't help me to get to know them. As we start to involve opportunities for students to have places where they can make choices, places where they can create opportunities for how they would like to engage with information or access information, places where they have a voice on what's happening not only in their classroom but in their school, we start to get more engagement. Now they're interested. Now they're a part of the process. It's not something being done to them, but with them. And ultimately, we want to get them all the way to the far right where they are empowered to make and create and do and collaborate and publish and demonstrate their learning so that they really are in charge. They can set their own learning goals, both in academics and success skills. They can identify the ways that they learn best and advocate for those systems to make sure that they're getting what they need. And all of that is connected to their peers and their community. Right now, during NTI, this is a perfect time for us to really have those conversations with students to help them grow their metacognitive skills and their ability to be more agents of their own learning. But we have to do our part with asking them the questions and providing them those scaffolds to get there. So there are 7 elements to learner agency, and we've talked a lot about voice and choice and how those things garner more student engagement. But there are other parts of learner agency as well. We need students to be motivated, and that can't really be an extrinsic motivation. It can't be that I got 7 out of 10 right, so that's a C, that's great, I mastered that, I'm done. That motivation needs to come from students. I think of a middle school math classroom where one teacher of the PLC chose to have students work on boxcars, and his students were so motivated on that boxcar project that they moved much more quickly through the standards that were required for that unit, that they were mastering those assessments and demonstrating their mastery of those in multiple ways much more quickly than his counterparts in his PLC students in those classes were, because they were motivated. They knew they couldn't go on to the next part of their boxcar until they had demonstrated mastery of these math skills that were needed to work on the boxcar. So again, that was intrinsic student motivation that helped them, and they owned it. They're like, can I take that next assessment? Can I show you I have this? They get to that place. We talked about ownership quite a bit already, but they also have to have purpose. So again, connecting on our quality work protocol, we talk about having work that matters to students. Everything they're doing has to have purpose. It has to have some meaning to them as students. We often get caught up in our own, of course this is important, it's my subject, it's my content, it's what I love, and therefore it is important in the whole wide world. But that is not always the case for a 10-year-old, a 15-year-old, or an 18-year-old. We have to find ways to make sure it matters to them, and one way to do that is to listen to them and listen to what matters for them and how we can connect our work to them. All of this kind of comes together to create this place where students experience self-efficacy. They know they're being successful. They've set their own goals. They've had their own motivations. They've chosen their own paths, and they are successful, and that becomes a cycle they want to repeat. All of that comes together to create agency.
And again, just to reiterate the big points of agency, kids have greater engagement and intrinsic motivation to learn. That means, they're more invested in what we're doing. They're invested in the learning experiences and the data that comes from that. They're able to make decisions about their learning experiences. They're more willing to challenge themselves because they start to develop deeper self-efficacy when they're given more power over the choices that they see in their learning experiences. With coaching from teachers, especially on the learning choices they make, they learn to constantly evaluate themselves and be self-reflective, academically and non-academically. And they have better problem-solving skills. If we don't ever give kids the ability to make decisions and fail and learn from them, they won't develop their problem-solving skills. So giving the kids the opportunity to make a meaningful decision about their learning is the first step. Conferring with them and reflecting on how that decision panned out and how they might continue to move forward from it is the next step. Helping learners continue to develop those reflective skills so they can find ways to succeed is how we help them become more reflective and better problem solvers.
Right, so just like we had the continuum of choice, there's also a continuum of ownership. And again, we start on the far left with that compliance piece where students or even adults have very little commitment to what they're participating in. They're just following the instructions. They may even answer questions when they're asked, and they complete their homework and they get a grade for it. This is where frequently in our traditional school system, some of our top students live in this land and they love it. They are straight A students. They're top of the class. They have figured out school. They know how to be compliant and get the grade. When we move over towards the far right of this continuum, where we have students with more autonomy, where their learning is driven by their own interests, their own passions, where they're monitoring their own progress. I always think about Socratic classrooms where when students ask questions, their response is a follow-up question, where they have to decide for themselves, am I mastering this or not? And what does that criteria look like? And how am I demonstrating it? When we start to get over into that space of autonomy and ownership, some of our students who are solid A+, top of the class students over on the compliance side struggle a little bit because they're not used to it. On the flip side of that, our students who are not so compliant and are oftentimes brilliant young minds, but in trouble sometimes at school because they're less than compliant, they will thrive when we give them more autonomy, and they will demonstrate learning that is well beyond what perhaps people expected of them, because they're able to do it in a way that is meaningful to them and that values who they are as people. So how can we help our learners develop agency and ownership? One way to do that is through the power of reflection. We talk a lot about reflection in education. If you've been in JCPS for a couple of years now, you know that we talk about reflection with MAP goals and MAP growth, and with our success skill artifacts. Kids are asked to reflect on them. Why do they reflect your growth in this success skill area? But when we talk about reflection and growing student agency, we have to ask different kinds of questions, because if we're giving students the opportunity to make choices about how they access and engage information and demonstrate their learning, we have to ask them to reflect on those choices that they've made. If you go back to the example I gave earlier about the elementary student who chose to sit on the ground or at a low table with his friends, and that did not go well, follow-up questions might be, why didn't that work for you? Did you get your work finished? If so, how did you persist through that? How did you engage with your peers? How did that help or hinder your learning? What can you learn from that engagement with your peers? What else might you need to learn, not only about your work habits, but also about the content that was being worked on today? How did you feel when you were successful? That same young man I went to, it was a different young man. I was at a middle school, and there was a young man who was sitting all by himself at a table. And when I asked him why he was over there, everyone else was with a partner or in a group. He said, I choose to be over here because I know I work better, and I feel confident when I get my work done and I get compliments on my good work. And he goes, I know that if I go sit with someone else, it's not going to happen. I said, so you haven't been assigned this seat? You haven't been told to be by yourself? The answer was no. I'm making this choice. He goes, but when I'm finished with this, if my friends are finished, then I can talk to them. But right now, this is the choice I need to make for my learning. And that's where we want all our students to be able to make those choices and reflect on them.
We also need to help our learners be able to problem solve when they don't have the ability to have the conditions that are best for their learning. Teaching kids to be reflective on what choices and what environments work best for their learning is great, but we need to arm them with the ability to respectfully advocate for those things, but also know how to problem solve when they're just simply not available. And reflecting with kids and coming up with, how do you persist through this learning, or what might you do with new learning, helps kids be able to problem solve through those things, so that no matter the environment, kids are able to be agents for their own learning and make it work.
Yeah, and it's important that we don't always wait to the end of a lesson or the end of a unit or the end of a project to ask these reflection questions. They need to become part of our every day, all the time interaction with students. Throughout a lesson, we may be asking them, how are you engaging with others? What are you learning? How can you learn more? What's happening now? How are you persisting? We don't have to wait until the end of a class, a unit, or a project to ask those questions. We can continuously ask them.
Good point. One of the highest leverage practices that we see all the time is through project-based learning. Project-based learning definitely has a critical mass in our district, in our state, in our nation, probably all over the world, to be quite honest. And some of the components that make project-based learning what it is lend itself to personalized learning. Now, that's not to say that every PBL is personalized or that every personalized learning system incorporates PBL. It's just one learning or unit design that tends to lend itself to personalized learning. Elements like student voice, sustained inquiry, a public product, reflection throughout, and continuous opportunities for critique and reflection definitely lend themselves to a personalized learning environment. When we think about some keys to implementing personalized learning, in addition to a design like PBL, these are some key components. So the first is using the learner as a resource. When we bring kids into the decision-making process, they begin to see themselves as resources. But we need to lift up these opportunities amongst learners and their peers so that the text and the internet and the adult in the room aren't the only resources for learning, but in fact, the other kids in the room are resources for learning as well. We're all experts in something. We all have strengths and we all have areas of growth, and we learn to leverage those, for good with each other. That's when kids start to see each other as resources. And some of the collaborative settings, having a peer-to-peer reviews, something as simple and tried and true as that helps learners see themselves as resources. Group projects, collaborative opportunities, collaborative discussions helps promote this as well. We've talked a lot about choice today. Choice by itself is a great step, but we're going to get a bigger bang for our buck in terms of building learner agency if those choices have meaning over the learning experience and over instructional decisions. And then we talk about path, pace, and a proficiency-based progression. So meaningful ways that learners can have choice are over their path or over their pace. So the pathway to learning are things like how kids access their learning, how kids engage with or practice learning or skills, or how they demonstrate learning. Giving learners choice over those elements of our workshop model helps them have agency over their pathway to learning and ultimately over their pathway to mastery. When we talk about pacing, a lot of times the pacing is determined by, a calendar or, a curriculum map or how many minutes are in a class. But when we start to make those decisions less time-based and hand them over to learners, learners can have agency over their own pace, within reason, of course, and with the coaching and the support of the teacher. And then finally, proficiency-based progress. Oh, were you going to say something, Joe?
No, I'm sorry. I have 4-footed interrupters.
That's okay. My coworker is currently wearing a cone and is crashing all over the place.
Yes, my coworker is interrupting me by trying to get under my desk.
Well, as far as proficiency-based progress, this again is switching that paradigm. Kids often progress when we need them to, whether they're ready to or not, or they progress, based on time. Proficiency-based progress is a huge shift. And when we talk about keys to implementing personalized learning, coaching kids to be analytical of their own mastery, to own their data, having coaching conversations with learners about formative assessment data, or the most recent assessment they took, or their own map data, or their assessment goals, helps learners have ownership over that pathway and helps them see when they're ready to progress based not on time, but on proficiency.
So I would just add that as we're moving into NTI, as we start school with NTI, all of those elements that Maddie was just talking about are things that are easily made part of a virtual classroom. We see learners as a resource as they start to create presentations and share their learning through their Google Classroom and their collaborative structures. We also see the flexibility and students having ownership of their path and how they engage, as we see more and more teachers using choice boards and must-do, may-do lists. We see shifts in student ownership over pace as kids are able to complete work in their own time as long as they meet a final deadline. They can finish something early. They can move on to the next thing. So we're starting to see more and more of that with NTI, and hopefully some of these practices will then lend themselves into your classrooms when we get back in them in person. One thing that we want to talk about that is a component of personalized learning that might be really helpful as we're moving into NTI is the learner profile. We talked about how we need to use the learner as a resource. And of course, now my dog's going to make noises. How to use the learner as a resource? Well, one way to do that is through the relationships we have with them and how we know them. And to build relationships, we can start creating a learner profile. And I'm going to mute now and turn it over to Maddie.
So when we talk about a learner profile, it can take many different forms. It can be digital or it can be physical. But it is, in either scenario, something that is dynamic. So when we talk about something that is physical, we see a lot with our younger learners, our like primary elementary learners, is that the learner profile is a binder or a notebook, just because it tends to be easier operationally for the kids to access often and update often. We also see it take a digital form. It might be a Google website. It might be Google Slides. And the components that are typically in a learner profile are items about the learner personally, their family, their likes, their dislikes, if they've been at any other schools before, their favorite subjects, their strengths, any of those things. We also incorporate information about the learner academically. What are their goals academically? What are their recent assessment data? What does that look like? What if they're in high school, what courses have they completed? What academy are they in? What are their career aspirations at the time? We also look at a third component, which is data. And this is one of the pieces that changes probably the most dynamically as we update the data that we have on learners, which should be constantly. So learners might keep track of their MAP scores and goals. They might keep track of formative assessment data or summative assessment data. And in this way, they develop goals. They can take ownership over what standards or skills they've mastered versus ones they still need to work on, and develop plans from that, which leads to another component of the learner profile, which is the personalized learning plan. And this is where learners identify actionable steps to reach the goals that they set for themselves, both academically and non-academically. And that's not to say that those components are the end-all be-all or that those are the only ones. Teachers and learners can add different components as they see fit. Those are just the ones that we tend to see most frequently. We have learner profiles that have existed in slides all over the district. There was a teacher at Wheeler that had her learners build a Google site. And so they had a web page for their personal pieces, a web page where they put all of their frequently used links that was just easier for them to use. We had, there was a web page where they kept a lot of their data and their goals. And so learners really took ownership of that. And because it was a web page that was housed in their Google Suite, they had really easy access and could update that often and really own it. The teacher then uses that to confer with learners and help inform the coaching conversations that she then had with them. So learner profiles can include lots of different things, look lots of different ways. The big piece here is that the learner has access to it. It changes and is updated and is dynamic, and it's used to help inform the learner's decision making as they take ownership over their learning goals and experiences.
Yeah, and I would just add for our secondary teachers that when you're looking at a learner profile or a learner plan, personalized learning plan, that for our secondary folks, a lot of times people immediately think of our ILP that all kids do, their instructional learning plan, that our counselors help kids with all the time. Those components that are part of that ILP can certainly become part of a learner profile, but it isn't in and of itself a learner profile or a personalized learning plan. But it certainly could be a piece of it. And some of our schools have started trying to create that either as a team of teachers within an academy, or a grade level team at a middle school, or a grade level team at an elementary school. They've started building those things in as part of their day-to-day work. So it's one thing that kids are looking at, and it's also frequently connected to their Google Classroom and their backpack, students' backpacks. Where else? That's where all their data is. Their attendance data, their behavior data, their backpack skills data that they feel worthy is going in there. So how can we help students bring all that together in one place? And also, when it's all together in one place, how can we use it as the educator who's helping them design those learning experiences? So just keep that in mind as you're moving forward.
So if you're a teacher, just kind of starting out, we're really looking at the learner profile so that, yes, we can understand our learners, and this is super important. Last year when we went into NTI, we had 6 months to get to know our learners. We don't have that luxury this year. So a learner profile, especially this year, can be important for teachers to gain, relationship information about learners. It can also help teachers make instructional decisions about learning designs, about how we interact with our learners when we get back to school, and we will. It can help teachers make decisions about classroom layout as well. It helps us identify how to incorporate voice and choice into our learning designs, and how to coach learners through making those choices and exercising that voice. And it's something that's good for all learners. It's not just for our high kids. It's something that helps engage and empower all of our learners. And it can help us shift to a competency-based scenario where learners are progressing when they show competency. We've got some videos embedded of kids talking about what this looks like for them and how powerful of an experience these shifts can be for young learners. So we'd encourage you to look at those, but I know we need to wrap up. And then we have some examples. We've got some resources embedded. We've got a lot of personalized learning components that teachers right here in JCPS shared with us during our first, kind of foray into NTI back in the spring. Websites that incorporate the district framework and personalize it to meet the needs of learners. Weekly menus of learning choices, how to communicate with parents, all kinds of ideas are housed right in this resource here. And then we also have some pieces just to show you how you might start to deconstruct your workshop model. We always have a mini lesson where we're, presenting new information, or kids are accessing new content. We've got a section where kids are working or engaging or practicing with new content or skills. And then there's almost always a piece where kids are demonstrating learning, either a formative assessment or something that's, a little bit more summative, an exit slip of some kind. But these three major components are present in all of our workshop model designs. And so we can take any one of these pieces within our workshop model and personalize just that one piece as we start to make these shifts. This is just another example of how to do that, how learners might have choice during this access phase, how learners might have another choice during their engagement phase when they're practicing. And then here, everyone has the same reflection question. So if you're just starting out, you don't have to personalize every single thing for every single kid every single day, but start small. Look at one part of your workshop, one choice or one demonstration of learning that you really want to focus on. It's okay to start small.
And again, this is just another video that we're not going to take time right now to show you, but hopefully you'll access this slide deck and watch these on your own.
The big thing here that we hope that people take away is that personalized learning is not putting kids on laptops. Of course, we can use technology to personalize learning, and it makes things a lot easier most of the time. However, using technology in itself is not personalized learning. And there are a lot of education technologies out there whose primary focus is to make money that will advertise that they are personalized learning. If the learner is taken out of the equation, if we're looking at predictive programs where the learner makes no decisions and has no agency, that's not personalized learning. What we don't want are classrooms from the 1800s where kids are sitting in rows and desks, and the only difference in 2020 is that now they're on laptops. Personalized learning is about learner agency. It's about collaborating with the learner and empowering them to collaborate productively with other learners and see each other as resources. But putting a kid in front of a laptop is not personalized learning. If you want to learn more about this subject, these are our district's touchstone texts. The book on the left is very short, just over 100 pages, and it's a whole school view, looking at what are some major shifts if a school wants to move towards personalized learning. This book also goes over what we call the honeycomb, which presents a framework for personalized learning and introduces teachers to some primary components. This is very user-friendly. Anyone from experts to neophytes alike will find something in this book to help your practice. That's a great place to start. Another book that we love is How to Personalize Learning. That's geared more towards the classroom practitioner. It's built around the workshop model and universal design for learning, which is something that's present throughout our curriculum frameworks and that we use in JCPS. So this definitely speaks our language, and again is very practitioner friendly. There's also some online resources that come with this book, and this one is really great on the nuts and bolts on how to get started in your classroom designs. So both of these are great if you want to learn more.
All right, so in closing, that's who we are, Maddie Shepard, Joe McKim. Our names are links to our email, so you can access us, but it is just first name dot last name and then at jefferson.kway.schools.us. And we're here to help. Reach out to us anytime.
Thanks for joining us, guys. And again, just if you have any questions or would like us to help you give you feedback, look at your learning designs, we'd love to do that. Thank you for joining us and have a great AIS week.